United States is a land of contrasts, technology, political power, and great advancements, but it is also a territory marked by mysteries that refuse to disappear. Over the decades, crimes, disappearances, and inexplicable phenomena have fueled theories, rumors, and legends that neither science nor the authorities have managed to fully resolve. Today, we are going to delve into some of the most unsettling enigmas in this country, cases that seem to defy all explanation, and which, despite the passage of time, continue to leave a trail of unanswered questions behind. So, get comfortable and turn off the lights, because these are 7 unsolved American mysteries. How are you? Good morning, afternoon, or evening? And here we begin. The Exorcism of Anna Ecklund. In the history of modern exorcisms, few cases have achieved as much notoriety as that of Anna Ecklund, a name used for many years to protect the identity of a woman who lived for decades under the chilling shadow of what the church considered a completely real case of demonic possession. Emma Schmidt. Her story began in her adolescence, when around the age of 14, she began to manifest symptoms that her relatives could not interpret. She felt repulsion toward sacred objects, suffered from intrusive and disturbing thoughts, and claimed that an invisible force prevented her from approaching churches. Over time, her attacks became more violent, accompanied by blasphemies, voice changes, and increasingly strange behaviors. The most repeated explanation pointed to her own family. It was said that her Aunt Mina, a woman labeled as a witch in her community, had poisoned her food with cursed herbs, but the darker rumors went even further. Mina was also the lover of Jacob, Emma's father, a man who had allegedly tried to abuse his daughter and, upon being rejected, cursed her with the help of his accomplice. For believers, this was the gateway for infernal forces to seize the young woman, condemning her to a life of torment. In 1912, when Emma could no longer control her attacks, she was subjected to an initial exorcism by Father Theophilus Riesinger, a Capuchin priest with experience in such rituals. The documents regarding that occasion are scarce, but it is claimed that he managed to give her a reprieve, though not a definitive one. Over the years, the voices returned along with bouts of uncontrollable violence, nightmarish visions, and behavior that her circle could not attribute to any known illness. By 1928, the situation was untenable. Riesinger was called again, this time with the support of Father Joseph Steiger, who provided a convent of Franciscan nuns in Earling, Iowa, as the setting for the ritual. There, on August 18, began a spiritual confrontation that would last for months. Emma, now 46, was taken in secret to protect her identity, and the strongest nuns were designated to assist the priest. The accounts of what happened transcend any fiction. Emma screamed, with multiple voices, some deep and masculine, others high and childlike. She spat insults in languages she had never learned, while her body twisted in impossible ways. At times, she would levitate above the bed, or cling to the doorframe as if an immense force were driving her. The stench in the room was unbearable. Vomiting of strange substances, sudden swelling of her face, and an absolute rejection of anything blessed. The demons that supposedly possessed her introduced themselves by clear names: Beelzebub, Judas Iscariot, her father Jacob, and Aunt Mina. According to witnesses, these voices alternated to attack her from within, blaming her, cursing those present, and proclaiming their dominion over her body. The tension in the convent was so great that several nuns asked to be transferred, unable to withstand what was happening in that cell. The exorcism took place in 3 phases. The first in August, another in September, and the final one in December, which lasted for 80 consecutive days. On the night of December 23, when Riesinger raised his voice in the name of the Holy Trinity and the Virgin Mary, Emma fell onto the bed, screaming the names of those who tormented her. Shortly after, she broke into shrieks, repeating the word hell again and again. The silence that followed was broken only by her own voice, clear and serene, saying, "My Jesus, mercy, praised be Jesus Christ." For those present, that was the sign of liberation. Emma survived, although records indicate that in later years she had minor episodes. She died decades later, and her case was released to the public under the pseudonym Anna Ecklund. In 1935, Father Karl Vogel published a book detailing the ritual, which soon circulated in several languages. Time magazine picked up the story in 1936, cementing it as one of the most documented exorcisms of the 20th century. Over time, her case transcended religion and became a cultural reference. Researchers cited it as proof of demonic possession, while others interpreted it as an example of psychological trauma read under the dogmas of the time. It even inspired William Peter Blatty in the creation of The Exorcist, and it recently returned to the conversation with films like The Exorcism or The Rite, which dramatize her story. The Exorcism of Anna Ecklund is, to this day, an unsettling account. For some, it confirms the existence of supernatural evil. For others, it is proof of how fear and faith can shape realities impossible to understand. The truth is that in the Erling convent, something so disturbing occurred that it still resonates, even after almost a century. The Kecksburg Incident. On the afternoon of the 9th of December, 1965, the sky over the northeastern United States lit up with a fireball that crossed the atmosphere at full speed. Witnesses in at least 6 states, and even Canada, described an incandescent object that left vibrations, rumbles, and, in some cases, small fires caused by what appeared to be burning metal. What was initially interpreted as a meteor fall ended up becoming one of the strangest mysteries of American ufology, so much so that many dubbed it the Roswell of Pennsylvania. In the small town of Kecksburg, about 45 minutes from Pittsburgh, several inhabitants claimed to have seen the object descend until it crashed into a nearby wooded area. Minutes later, a vibration traveled through the ground, and a loud thud echoed in the distance. Some neighbors ran to the site and, according to their testimonies, found something that did not seem to have a natural origin. They described a bronze-colored metal capsule shaped like an acorn, the size of a Volkswagen, covered in symbols that resembled hieroglyphics. That vision seemed taken from a technological nightmare that no one could understand. The surprise lasted little, for police patrols and army trucks soon arrived and cordoned off the area. Civilians were forced to retreat, and according to several witnesses, what followed was a full-scale operation. Armed soldiers went into the woods, and shortly after, a truck left with something bulky covered by heavy tarps. That same night, the local press went from talking about an object found to declaring that the search had yielded nothing. Whatever had fallen in Kecksburg had disappeared in a matter of hours. Official explanations oscillated between a disintegrated meteor and a Soviet satellite. Decades later, in 2005, NASA claimed that the fragments corresponded to a Russian spacecraft, although it admitted that the documents confirming it had been lost in the ADS. Other studies contradicted that version, as the trajectory did not match that of Cosmos 96, nor any other known object in orbit. For many, this was proof that the truth was being buried along with the evidence. Meanwhile, the neighbors never forgot what they had witnessed. The object had descended with too much precision to be a space rock. Others pointed out that the inscriptions were a sign of technology alien to Earth. There was even no lack of those who related it all to Die Glocke, the mythical bell that, according to certain theories, had disappeared in the final days of the war. The official silence only fueled the myth. Researchers like Leslie Kean even sued NASA to obtain documents, but all they managed to discover were contradictions and gaps in all the reports. With each ambiguous explanation and each lost file, the suspicion only grew. There was something there they did not want to reveal. Today, almost 6 decades later, Kecksburg has embraced that episode as part of its identity. At the entrance to the town stands a replica of the space acorn, the strange acorn-shaped object that many claim to have seen. Each year, during the local festival, the inhabitants celebrate the story that marked them forever. Amidst fair stalls, UFO conferences, and parades in honor of the inexplicable, the mystery remains open today, and the only certainty is that on that night in December, something crossed the sky, fell into the forests of Pennsylvania, and was removed under a cloak of silence. The truth about what it was remains hidden among lost documents, official contradictions, and ambiguous answers, as if someone were still refusing to let it come to light. The assassination of Ken Rex McElroy. On the morning of the 10th of July 1981, the silence of Skidmore, a small town in Missouri, was shattered by the roar of dozens of shots. On the main street, a man fell dead inside his pickup truck. He had received shots to the head and neck at near point-blank range. He died immediately. Beside him, his wife screamed in desperation, pointing toward the crowd, convinced she had seen the perpetrators, but no one answered. More than 30 people were there, watching in silence while the figure who had dominated the town with violence and threats lay motionless, still gripping the steering wheel of his truck. It was Ken Rex McElroy. To understand how they reached that moment, one must go back decades. McElroy was born in 1934 into a large, poor family and left school at 15. From then on, He dedicated himself to crime, first as a cattle and pig thief, and later as an increasingly violent criminal. He was accused of arson, assault, robbery, and even rape, but he was never convicted. This was mainly because, over time, he had perfected a method that sowed terror among witnesses. He would watch their homes at night from a truck, parking in front of their windows for hours, staring without saying anything, until fear made everyone keep quiet. Justice never caught up with him because those who could accuse him were too afraid to do so. His personal life was equally dark. He had more than 10 children, but his most well-known relationship was with Trenna McLeod, whom he met when she was just 12 years old. He got her pregnant at 14, married her to avoid a rape trial, and kept her under absolute control, just like the rest of the town. Ken Rex McElroy was not a simple criminal. He was a predator who imposed his will with threats and gunfire, a man who seemed to feed on the fear of others. In 1980, an insignificant situation lit the fuse. One of his daughters was caught stealing a candy bar in the store of the Boy Courts, an elderly couple very beloved in the community. What could have been resolved with an apology turned into a personal war. McElroy harassed the family for weeks until, one day, he shot at Ernest Boycourt and shattered his neck. The old man survived, and for the first time in years, it seemed there would be justice, as McElroy was convicted. However, he was soon released on bail thanks to his lawyer, and returned to the streets with more rage than ever. It was at that point that the fear in Skidmore transformed into desperation. Everyone knew it was a matter of time before he attacked again. They sought support from the authorities, asked for protection, wrote letters, but nothing changed. And then, on that July 10th, they understood there would be no more chances. That day, McElroy left the D&G Tavern, his usual hangout, with a pack of beers in his hand and climbed calmly into his truck. He started the engine as if nothing could happen to him, convinced that the fear he had always imposed would protect him once more. That was when the net closed around him. Dozens of neighbors began to leave the bar, walking in silence until they occupied the entire street. No one spoke, no one shouted. There was only an instant of absolute tension that ended when the first shot broke the silence. The windshield shattered, the engine roared in vain, and immediately, a barrage of bullets echoed throughout the town. McElroy's body shook with each impact while Trenna tried to cover him, and in a matter of seconds, the man who seemed untouchable was dead in front of everyone. When the police arrived, they found casings from 2 different weapons and more than 30 witnesses who repeated the same phrase. They had not seen anything. There were never any arrests, no culprits, no trials. The case was closed as if McElroy had died at the hands of unknown persons, and that is how it was recorded in official files. That was the end of Ken Rex McElroy, a man who turned an entire town into his prey and ended up falling under a pact of silence as impenetrable as the fear he himself sowed. Skidmore never again suffered under his shadow, but in exchange, it remained marked forever, turning the entire town into accomplices to a crime witnessed by all, about which no one ever spoke. By the way, if you enjoy this type of content, we remind you that you can now listen to Catastrophico, our new exclusive podcast on Podimo. There, we talk about the most shocking tragedies in history like never before, and we do it uncensored. We premiere a new episode every Monday, and you can easily join from the link in the description and the pinned comment, as well as on all our social networks. The Blobs of Oakville. In the early morning of the 7th of August, 1994, the inhabitants of Oakville, a small town in the state of Washington, woke up to a very strange rain. It was not water droplets that were falling on roofs, yards, and roads, but a kind of transparent, cold, soft lump that, upon touch, dissolved as if it were made of gelatin. Within hours, this substance had covered an area of more than 50 square kilometers. Officer David Lacey was patrolling at that hour with a friend when the storm began. He turned on his patrol car's windshield wipers, thinking it was just any rain. But instead of clearing the glass, the substance spread like a viscous paste that soon blocked his view. Forced to stop at a gas station, he put on gloves and removed part of that material by hand, describing it later as an odorless, soft, and slippery jelly, identical to holding a handful of gelatin. Hours later, when the sky was already still, a neighbor named Dottie Hearn went out to her yard. On the firewood, she thought she saw traces of hail, but upon touching one of the lumps, she found the same strange texture. It was something that did not fit with any form of rain she had ever known in her life. The bewilderment soon turned into concern, for that same afternoon, several neighbors began to get sick. There were symptoms of dizziness, blurred vision, difficulty breathing, intense nausea, and a weakness that forced them to stay in bed. Lacey himself fell ill, doubled over by vomiting and lack of air. Dottie collapsed in the bathroom, and her daughter, Sonny Barclift, had to take her to the hospital, where doctors kept her for several days with a diagnosis of an ear infection. Over the weeks, dozens of residents described the same flu-like illness that lingered for months, while some pets that had licked or ingested the substance began to appear dead in yards and farms, although none of the bodies were collected for analysis. And when it seemed that everything was over, this gelatin fell 5 more times over the course of 3 weeks, always in the same area, and always with the same pasty texture that turned to mush when pressed. It had no smell, and furthermore, left behind a trail of illness and death. Sonny Barclift, Dottie's daughter, sensed from the first moment that this substance and her mother's illness were connected, so she collected some in a jar and took it to the local hospital. The initial analysis left the technicians bewildered. They claimed it was composed of cells very similar to human white blood cells, though without a nucleus, which made it impossible to classify. Unable to provide more answers, they sent the material to the Washington State Department of Health. And there, microbiologist Mike McDowell studied the sample and discovered 2 types of bacteria, one of them Enterobacter cloacae, common in the human digestive system, and the other Pseudomonas fluorescens, present in soil and water. For some, this could mean that the blobs were of biological origin, perhaps remains of some organism, but others, instead, clung to the theory that they were human waste dumped from an airplane. However, this hypothesis, the most macabre of all, was discarded quite quickly, as material falling from aircraft is usually stained blue, chemically treated, and frozen, nothing like the soft, transparent substance that had covered Oakville. The most unsettling thing was what happened next. According to McDowell, when he returned to the laboratory to continue testing, the sample had disappeared without a trace, and when he asked what had happened, he only received one answer from his superiors: "Do not ask." A year later, Sonny took another frozen portion of this substance to Amtest Laboratories, a private center. Microbiologist Tim Davis stated that under the microscope, he had found eukaryotic cells, that is, with a nucleus, the type of cells present in most living organisms. And so the conclusion became as strange as it was disturbing. The blobs were, or had been, alive. With this new information, the theories multiplied. Many inhabitants were convinced that the military had something to do with it, as just during those weeks, the Navy had been conducting bombing exercises over the Pacific, about 80 kilometers from Oakville. One of the most popular hypotheses pointed out that the explosions had pulverized banks of jellyfish, scattering their remains into the clouds from where they ended up falling on the town. But others went further. They suspected intentional biological testing, secret experiments performed on a small and isolated community. The Army denied any responsibility, although several residents claimed to have seen military planes flying over the area shortly before the rain. There were also attempts to explain the phenomenon with older hypotheses. Since the Middle Ages, there had been accounts of a gelatinous substance known as star jelly associated with meteorites or strange rains. In some cases, it had been proven to be amphibian eggs, algae, or polymers that absorb water. However, something as persistent and harmful as what happened in Oakville had never been documented, and so the phenomenon never repeated itself. None of the explanations, neither planes, nor jellyfish, nor military experiments, has managed to resolve this enigma. All that remained were testimonies, suspicions, and a rather uncomfortable silence from the authorities. Almost 3 decades later, the only thing that is clear is that something fell from the sky in Oakville, something that made people sick, killed animals, and disappeared from the labs without a trace. And since then, the question remains open, as thick and opaque as the lumps that, one morning in 1994, turned the rain into an impossible-to-explain mystery. The Cash-Landrum Incident. At the end of 1980, Texas was the scene of an incident that still divides opinions today among believers, skeptics, and specialists in aerial phenomena. This is the Cash-Landrum case, one of the strangest and most disturbing encounters in the history of alleged UFO sightings, not only because of what was seen that night, but because of the serious consequences it left on the witnesses. On December 29 of that year, Betty Cash, 51, was driving along a rural road north of Houston in the company of her friend Vicki Landrum and the latter's grandson Colby, just 7 years old. What began as a quiet drive home ended in an episode that would mark their lives forever. The three first noticed an intense light filtering through the trees. At first, they thought it was a plane descending toward the Houston airport, but in a matter of minutes, it transformed into a gigantic object floating at the height of the pine treetops. According to their description, it was shaped like a truncated diamond, surrounded by blue lights and with flames coming from its base. Each time the fire went out, it would descend slowly, and when it flared up again, it would rise again. The heat was so suffocating that it pierced the windshield and made the car's metal burn to the touch. Betty got out of the vehicle to observe it better and was paralyzed by the intensity of the radiation. Vicky, more frightened, returned to the car to comfort Colby, who was crying, believing that it was a divine sign. "It's Jesus. He won't hurt us," his grandmother kept telling him. When trying to return to the driver's seat, Betty could barely open the door. The handle was burning. Vicky, upon leaning on the dashboard, left a dent in the vinyl that, it is claimed, remained visible for weeks. Suddenly, the object began to rise, and at that moment, a fleet of helicopters burst into the night sky. Between 20 and 23 double-rotor aircraft, identified later by the witnesses as CH-47 Chinooks, surrounded the artifact and escorted it until it disappeared into the distance. Some inhabitants of the area, including a police officer and his wife, confirmed having seen the helicopter formation that same night. The encounter lasted about 20 minutes. However, the worst was yet to come. Hours later, the three began to feel sick. Colby woke up with fever and vomiting. Vicky suffered nausea and a strange burning sensation on her skin. Betty was the most affected. Her temperature spiked. Blisters appeared on her face and hands, and her body began to weaken until she was bedridden. On January 3, she was hospitalized with a condition that her doctors described as acute radiation. She spent 6 weeks interned, lost more than half of her hair and parts of her skin, and never fully regained her health. Vicky and Colby also developed symptoms, although to a lesser extent. Weakness, skin lesions, partial hair loss, and in Vicky's case, vision problems that led to cataracts. During the following years, Betty received constant treatment for cancer and other complications related to the event. When civilian researchers arrived at the site, they found an area of the asphalt with burn marks. Shortly after, that section was torn up and replaced by new pavement transported in unmarked trucks, which further fueled suspicions of a cover-up. The media pressure led the victims to seek legal support. They met at Bergstrom Air Force Base with Air Force officers who listened to their statements for hours. In the room was a map on which, according to them, the exact point of the sighting was marked. Even so, the military denied any operation on that date and told them they could file a formal lawsuit. Betty and Vicky did so, demanding $20 million from the United States government, but the case was dismissed in 1986 for lack of evidence linking the helicopters to the military. Over time, all kinds of hypotheses appeared. For some researchers of the UFO phenomenon, it was a failed military experiment, perhaps a prototype of a nuclear-powered spacecraft that released radiation without control. Others maintain that it was an object of unknown origin escorted by official helicopters. In the most skeptical extreme, it was suggested that it could have been an optical illusion combined with previous illnesses of the witnesses, although medical reports on Betty's burns and hair loss contradict that simplistic view. Even in current forums and debates, many have tried to provide technical explanations. Some compare the phenomenon with old aerial nuclear propulsion projects that the U.S. Army investigated in the Cold War, something like a flying Chernobyl. Others discard this idea, pointing out that an accident of that magnitude would have left radioactive traces impossible to hide. The truth is that neither the lawsuit, nor independent investigations, nor the alleged testimonies of military personnel have been able to clarify what really happened that night. Betty Cash died in 1998, exactly 18 years after the encounter. Vicky Landrum passed away in 2007. Colby is still alive and keeps alive the hope that someday someone will explain what it was that marked them for life. The Cash-Landrum case remains open a file where physical pain, conspiracy theories, and the feeling that, in the middle of the road, 3 people were exposed to something that should never have been there, all blend together. The assassination of Mary Pinchot Meyer. On the 12th of October 1964, Mary Pinchot Meyer, a recognized painter in the artistic circles of Georgetown and the ex-wife of a high-ranking CIA official, left her studio to take a walk along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal towpath. Minutes later, she was dead with 2 precise shots, one to the head and another to the back. What appeared to be a random attack soon became one of the most enigmatic crimes in the American capital, as Mary's life was intertwined with some of the most influential figures in the country. Mary was born into a wealthy and intellectual family. Her father, Amos Pinchot, was a highly prestigious progressive lawyer, and her mother, Ruth, was a journalist with liberal ideas. Her sister, Toni, was married to Ben Bradley, a future editor of the Washington Post, which placed Mary in the heart of the political and media elite of the era. In 1945, she married Cord Meyer, a war hero who soon became one of the men trusted by the CIA. The couple had 3 children, but the death of the eldest in an accident and the growing tensions with Cord's secret life ended in a divorce that was finalized in 1958. After this separation, Mary decided to rebuild her life. She returned to painting with intensity, moved among avant-garde artists, and at the same time grew close to the Kennedy family. With John F. W. Kennedy, whom she had known since her youth, she began an intimate relationship that, according to various testimonies, was not fleeting. With him, she shared discussions about politics and also personal moments that would later feed the legend of a romance that had been kept hidden from public opinion. On the day of the murder, Mary was wearing comfortable clothes for walking. Witnesses heard screams for help and 2 shots. A mechanic named Henry Wiggins, who was working on a car very close to the canal, claimed to have seen an African-American man in a light jacket and dark cap leaning over the woman's body. The police arrested a suspect not far from there, Raymond Crump Jr., a 25-year-old worker who had wet and torn clothing. The investigation, however, was plagued with inconsistencies. The weapon never appeared, there was no blood on Crump's clothing, and the physical description of the attacker did not match him. Even so, the man was taken to trial. His lawyer, Dovie Johnson Roundtree, denounced the racial bias behind this accusation and evidenced the lack of evidence. Crump was acquitted in 1965, and the case remained officially unsolved. If Mary's figure already awakened interest on its own, what happened after her death multiplied these suspicions. Her sister Toni and her brother-in-law Ben Bradley found James Angleton, the CIA's head of counterintelligence and a close friend of Cord Meyer, in the artist's studio. Angleton was forcing entry to recover a personal diary that, as it was later learned, contained intimate reflections, artistic notes, and possible details of her relationship with Kennedy. The notebook was handed over to Angleton and, according to the Bradleys, destroyed at CIA headquarters. Decades later, Ben Bradley himself would confirm the episode in his memoirs, fueling the idea of a deliberate cover-up. Over time, more pieces appeared that gave the tragedy an air of conspiracy. The psychologist Timothy Leary, a central figure in the psychedelic movement, claimed that Mary had visited him to learn how to lead LSD sessions, convinced that these experiences could open the minds of political leaders toward peace. According to him, after the death of John F. Kennedy, Mary feared for her safety and confessed to him that there were forces that would not allow certain changes. These claims were questioned even by her own biographers, but they never stopped fueling this mystery. For some investigators, all these elements fit the theory that Mary was silenced for knowing too much. Her closeness to the president, her access to the CIA circle through Cord Meyer, and her critical stance regarding the war would have made her an uncomfortable target at a time when the official version of the Kennedy assassination was barely beginning to settle with the publication of the Warren Commission report. Others, meanwhile, maintain that the crime was simply a violent and random attack, and that Crump's acquittal does not mean he was innocent. Mary Meyer was buried on the day she would have turned 44. The killer was never found, the weapon was never recovered, and all that remains is the uncomfortable certainty that someone wanted this woman to stop talking, and they succeeded. The Smiley face killers. In the United States, every winter a scene repeats itself that at first glance looks like a tragic coincidence. Young university students, almost always white, athletic males with good grades, disappear after a night of partying. Their bodies appear days or weeks later in nearby rivers, lakes, or ponds, and the authorities conclude that it was an accident related to alcohol. However, behind those deaths exists a pattern so unsettling that many refuse to believe it is a coincidence. That pattern is known as the theory of the smiley face killers. It all started in the late 90s, when 2 retired New York detectives, Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte, began to notice similarities between cases occurring in different states of the country. Over time, criminologist Lee Gilbertson joined them, and together they proposed a hypothesis as disturbing as it was controversial: that dozens of these young men did not die by accident, but were victims of a network of killers who act in an organized manner, kidnapping them, murdering them, and throwing their bodies into the water to erase evidence. What gave the theory its name was a macabre detail. In at least a dozen of the crime scenes, graffiti was found with a smiley face painted near the place where a body appeared. For the detectives, that symbol was the mocking signature of the perpetrators. For the police, on the other hand, it was nothing more than a coincidence, a common figure in urban vandalism. But beyond the graffiti, what fueled the suspicion were the inconsistencies in several of the cases. One of the most cited is that of Patrick McNeil, a 21-year-old student who in February 1997 left a bar in Manhattan and disappeared. His body was found 2 months later in the East River, 12 miles away from the place where he was last seen. Patrick was floating face up, something rare in a drowning, and had marks on his neck that suggested strangulation. Furthermore, the forensic experts noticed that his body did not seem to have been in the water during all that time, but only a few days. Years later, private investigators concluded that Patrick had been held somewhere, murdered, and then thrown into the river. The case of Chris Jenkins in Minneapolis also contradicts the official explanation. On Halloween of 2002, Chris was kicked out of a bar while still wearing a Native American costume. 4 months later, he appeared in the Mississippi River with his arms crossed over his chest and his costume intact, as if someone had arranged him in that manner. At first, it was declared an accidental drowning, but in 2006 the case was reopened and finally classified as a homicide. Another example is Todd Geib, 22, who disappeared after a party in Michigan in 2005. Weeks later, his body appeared floating in an upright position, with his head and shoulders out of the water, as if he were standing, waiting to be found. The place had been searched several times without results, which fueled the theory that Todd was murdered elsewhere and placed there later. In 2006, Lucas Homan disappeared during Oktoberfest in La Crosse, Wisconsin. 3 days later, his body appeared in the Mississippi. An independent analysis determined that he had only been in the water for a few hours, not the 2 days that the police calculated. Additionally, he had marks that looked like boot prints on his forehead. Near the place, once again, someone painted a smiley face. More recent are the cases of Dakota James and Tommy Booth. Dakota, 23, was last seen in 2017 walking toward his apartment in Pittsburgh. 40 days later, he appeared in the Ohio River without signs of having been submerged for so long. In 2018, Tommy attended a friend's birthday party in Pennsylvania. Security cameras recorded him entering the bar, but never leaving. 2 weeks later, he appeared dead in a creek behind the place, surrounded by branches arranged in a strange way. A few meters away, a smiley face graffiti seemed to observe it all, and they are not the only ones. Zachary Mars, Matthew Genovese, Anthony Urena, Henry McCabe, and dozens more complete a list that, according to the detectives, exceeds 40 cases in different states. Many bodies appeared in areas already searched, some without water in their lungs, meaning they did not drown, and others with traces of drugs like GHB, the date rape drug, in their systems. The defenders of the theory believe the young men were kidnapped, held for days or weeks, drugged, psychologically tortured, and finally murdered. Afterward, their bodies were placed in the water to simulate an accident. The smiley face would be a form of mockery, a message directed at the families and the authorities. The FBI, however, has been clear. There is no evidence that a group of killers exists. In an official statement in 2008, the agency stated that the vast majority of these incidents appear to be drownings related to alcohol consumption. For many experts, the pattern is illusory. Drunken students who, in cold cities traversed by rivers, end up falling into the water. The rest would be simple coincidences amplified by imagination and fear. Criminologists like Pat Brown point out that graffiti proves nothing. A smiley face is one of the most common symbols, and if one looks hard enough, they will always find one nearby. Others recall that the alleged simultaneous murders in different states are incompatible with the logistics of a single group or individual, but the victims' families are not convinced. Many insist that their children were not as drunk as was said, that they were good swimmers, and that the bodies did not show signs consistent with drowning. Some have even funded private investigations that, on occasion, have found unsettling clues, although never conclusive evidence. Over time, the smiley face killers theory became a cultural phenomenon. It has been the subject of documentaries, books, articles, and even horror movies. For some, it is proof that there is a macabre conspiracy operating in the shadows. For others, it is an example of how the need to find meaning in tragedy can transform accidents into stories of invisible killers. The truth is that, beyond the theories, the facts persist. Dozens of young people have died in strange circumstances, and many of those families are still waiting for convincing answers. Maybe they were accidents, maybe coincidences, or maybe something much darker. Today, more than 2 decades after the first cases, this remains a mystery. And as long as no one manages to prove otherwise, the face drawn on a wall will continue to remind us that sometimes the line between an accident and a crime is as thin as a stroke of paint on a wall. Thanks for subscribing, leaving your like, and following us on social media. We hope you enjoyed these mysteries. Without further ado, I bid you farewell. See you later.